This is called fan lace for the obvious reason that these little fan-shaped pieces exist. The piece you're looking at it was just knitted. It hasn't been blocked or washed yet, which can make it stand out more like this. My friend Monique invented the way to make this work on knitting looms and has kindly permitted me to make a video so we can all learn to do it. This diagram won't mean a great deal to you yet, but I'm showing it to you first to give you some help visualizing what goes on. These V's are columns of stitches, and what we'll be doing is knitting 2 stitches, then going behind some pegs, wrapping a peg, coming back and knitting the same 2 stitches for row 2. Row 3 we knit them, go out and wrap, come back and knit them row 4. Row 5 we knit them, go out and wrap, come back and knit them, and then we move across and we do the same thing here and here, and then on up. Think of it as filling in a grid with these little fans. Gradually this might start to make sense to you as we knit, so let's do that. Here I'm knitting a very small piece of it. You can make a piece as wide as a blanket or a tablecloth if you want to, but the premise is the same either way. So we will start moving right to left, because I just finished a row going left to right. Knit those first 2 pegs. Put the yarn behind 2. Don't knit the second one. Wrap it. Come back. So that row 1 is completed on these few pegs for this little segment of the grid. There's row 2. Bring the yarn back around. Row 3 goes right to left, behind 2 pegs, wrap a peg, back to the original 2. I am using here a loosened flat stitch. The loosening doesn't show much. It's when I do that, because I don't want this to get really tight, but I also do not want sloppy stitches for the columns of stitches between the fans. So that's 4 rows completed, and here you can have a look. This was the original stitch on the peg plus 2 wraps, where we knitted row 1, wrapped back and knitted row 2, row 3, wrapped back and knitted row 4. So we're now ready to knit rows 5 and 6. It's important that you keep your strands of yarn going behind the pegs when you wrap, otherwise they will get stuck and they will not drop down into the loom as you knit, as in the way that they're supposed to do. So row 6 is coming up. Whoops, I lost hold of my yarn, no problem. Now it's time to move on across and knit the next fan. So to get there, we knit these first 2 stitches off, go behind the same pegs we've been going behind, then have a look. Original stitch, and all this stuff, the 3 wraps plus the original stitch, all lift up and over. And that segment is completed. This is what we just did. I'm outlining it with my tool. All the stitches between the fans are in pairs, so we just knitted off this one. We will knit off the second one, and we're beginning the next row 1. It's groups of 6 rows. So behind these 2 pegs, repeating exactly what we just did on the other few pegs. just in a new place. Row 2. Come back around here and begin row 3. Behind the 2 pegs, wrap, come back and knit row 4. Now about those skipped pegs, they're just space holders. So if you wish to change the look of your fans, you can skip 1 peg or more than 2 pegs. In my opinion, on this kind of loom, more than 2 gets pretty sloppy. But looms vary. In a sock loom, it would be a different matter. All right, that ends row 5. So we'll come back and knit row 6, and we can double check that I've counted correctly, because there should always be unknitted, before we knit over, 3 new loops. And in this case, plus the original stitch. On the first row, you won't have an original stitch yet. I will show you that in a minute. So I did count correctly. Time to knit over to them. And knit them all off. And here's what we just did. Now, the sides of the work need to be sort of even. Let me pull that swatch back over. They need to grow at the same rate as the center. Otherwise, we'll get a wadded up mess. This here is what we're about to do. Knit the section that allows the growth to even up with the other pieces. We just knitted this stitch off. So this will complete row 1 of the 6 rows that will even up our edges. 2, 3, and you would do this every time you get to an edge, no matter how many sections of fan you've listed, that you've knitted across. But I lost count, so I'm going to go off camera and count these rows. Be right back. Okay, we need 2 more rows to make the edge even. That's row 5 and row 6, and you should end up back at the edge. Now we're going to start another fan. Every fan begins with the 2 stitches, so there's stitches 1 and 2 of row 1, then behind 2 pegs, around a peg, back to the original stitches. These constitute row 2, and so on. I'll see you when I have row 6 completed here. I'm back with row 6 completed, and to double check, there should be 1 loop for every 2 rows, and so there are 3 loops plus the original stitch. We're good to go. Let's knit over to it, to the pile of loops, that is. And knit them off. And since this stitch is actually the very first stitch of this next fan, I'll just set up and do them both this time. That's row 1 of this fan. Go to the right and wrap. Row 2 of this fan. Row 3, moving right again. Go over and wrap. Row 4. Row 5, which ends in a wrap. And row 6. Time to go over and knit these off. There is the correct number of loops, which is 3 plus an original stitch. So we'll go on over and do that. Now we need our end spacing, the little chain that goes up the end. Yes, that's one of them. Let's do 6 rows on these two. As Monique points out, this is a somewhat playful, flexible technique. You can change the number of rows. You may change the number of pegs that space the fans. And you may want to do that. Depending on your yarn and your loom, you may find that one effect is very much better than another one, even though they're not very different. I mean, fundamentally, we're doing the same thing. In a minute, we're going to cast on another section using the other side of the loom. And I'll show you that, and we'll experiment together, because what I'm going to do is only use one peg as a spacer. A lot of this is for practicality, so I have enough stitches on the loom to show you multiple segments. But some of it is because I would like to see how this weight of yarn works with shorter fans. So let's do that now. To keep things clear, I'm changing colors of yarn, but this is the same kind of yarn. Both colors are Deborah Norville Everyday Worsted, which is exceptionally nice stuff. The loop that we knotted into the yarn as we start most things is going on the leftmost peg that we want to use, then a double E-wrap on the next one. And that's cast on. Now let's skip only one peg. This counts as row 2, row 3. The cast on works the same no matter how many pegs you decide to skip. So where I said skip 1, if you want to skip 2, do so. In general, I think it's going to be always desirable to skip the same number of pegs for every little bit of fan. Now this is row 6, and here is the difference between this row and every other row. There was not a stitch on this to begin with, so all we have is our 3 wraps, and that is okay. Just don't be surprised that there's a difference. There's no harm in that difference. Knit over to the held loops and knit them, all 3 of them, over. Now this peg is fully in work, and it's just the same thing as we started over here with the loop that we hung on. We have a stitch. We need a stitch next door. So we'll double E-wrap and create one. Let me make a little correction here. The way I double E-wrap the first time, I really am not crazy about it as a starting stitch. So I'm going to do it backwards from that. It makes a tighter working stitch. That's row 1. We come over here, skip a peg and wrap. knit back, row 2, I'm setting myself up all the way to the wrap for row 3, which is actually physically easier to do than knitting these two off and then wrapping. So if it doesn't confuse you, you may want to do it just as I am doing it. That was row 4 that we just completed. Time to knit row 5, and I'm setting myself up through the wrap. The trick to this is just don't pull that wrap too tightly, because you may need some of the length of yarn to pull into these stitches. And last row. That's 6 rows. We have 3 loops. Let me separate them so you can see them a little better. Okie dokie, let's knit over to them and add an additional fan. Double E wrapping. That counts as the start of row 1. Over and wrap. Come back, and here we are on row 2. Row 3 and wrap. You may wonder how I'm deciding whether to wrap the end peg or not, and it's the most practical reason in the world, but it won't always be true for you. I'm working behind a camera. I do not have the ideal knitting position, so I'm doing whatever I can reach at that particular time. I have short arms. You haven't seen me, so you don't know that, but believe me when I say my arms are short, so this is a little bit of a challenge for me, and I just do the best I can. Now this will be our edge segment, but remember we always end up needing 2 stitches to end with. So I'll knit these over, and then we'll come over and double E wrap. And now we're started. Remember what we're doing now? We're evening up the edges. So that's row 1, row 2, row 3, row 4, row 5, and row 6. And we're ready to start back moving from right to left. Now let's have another look at this picture. Does it make a little bit of sense now? I see that when I was drawing this, I did kind of leave something out. This is what we just did, this edge. And really, now we're going to do this. 6 rows of 2 columns of stitches. And this really wraps around the same peg that's holding this column of stitches. If this confuses you no end, this just isn't the way you see things, don't worry about it. Just follow the instructions. For me and for some of us, seeing it graphically laid out is a memory help. But if it's not a help to you, you can afford to completely ignore it. Don't stress out over it. We have a fully completed first row of the green with only 1 spacer peg. I'm going to knit a few rows so we can compare, and I'll do that off camera, and we'll get together when I'm done and have a look at it. Here we are with a nice swatch of the green done. remembering that the difference between this and the pink is that I only skipped a single peg as the spacer for the fans. And I definitely think that I prefer this look with this yarn and this loom. Remember, it's going to vary enormously from loom to loom and yarn to yarn. This is a Cindy Wood 5/8 inch spacing loom, just in case you want to know, and I'm using worsted weight yarn. And I really like that look. But you may wonder, and I have wondered, how do we finish? You could just bind off here and you'd have significant spaces, and it would resemble, though not be exactly like, the cast on where we have these strands of yarn at the beginning. It's not my favorite look. Actually, given what I've been doing just now, when I next use this yarn, I will also shorten up my spaces so my fans are shorter and tidier. But I don't know if this will shorten that up as much as I would like. This is what I did on this one. I put the out of work pegs into work, basically wrapped them and then started knitting them on the next rows, and then did a couple rows of stockinette and bound off. Without the couple of rows of stockinette, but with the adding in of the pegs, is something that I would like to try now to make sort of a plain cord at the edge. So let's knit across the ones we've got. 1, 2. Let's double E-wrap so we get a true stitch on there. Cast on. Knit these normally. Double E-wrap. Oops. It's going to be better the other direction. And knit the next two normally. And here comes my last empty peg. And we'll knit these two normally. Now you could cast off from this point using any method you like. I will use the transfer method, which is move the edge stitch to the next peg, wrap the peg and knit both loops over, lift the next loop off, and repeat. When I said next loop, I mean a stitch is formed when you knit those two loops over. We move that new stitch to the next peg, and it's actually creating a chain stitched bind off. You have a good bit of control over exactly how tight your bind off is here, and you will just need to learn by feel what suits you. It would be different for this project than, say, for socks or a sweater. You just have different needs for the fabric. And speaking of the fabric, what are we going to do with it once we've finished? The logical first things are scarves and shawls. Very pretty. And they work out nicely as plain old rectangles. A scarf is just a long, skinny rectangle. If you get ambitious, you could knit a big piece of it, a long, skinny piece, and then use it as the hem of a dress. You could knit something like a tablecloth if you had plenty of time and a beautiful yarn. Even a bedspread. Okay, let me get this off and we'll take a look at it together. This is what we just did, the bind off. I like that quite well as an end. It's a good solid cord. To review, the way I got there was I went across knitting the stitches we had and double E-wrapping the blank spots, knitting them over so that I would have a true stitch to bind off with the transfer bind off moving the other way. And there is the piece of fabric. Let me get you a different perspective on it. Very pretty stuff. Thank you, Monique. I think we are all going to have a tremendous amount of fun with this.